Somewhere in the pine flatwoods of southwest Alabama, buried beneath a hillside that looks like nothing more than ordinary forest floor, archaeologists once found a literal pavement of broken pottery. Not decorative pottery, not funerary pottery, thousands of shattered clay vessels deliberately made to be used once and thrown away, stacked in layers that took 1,000 years to accumulate. For a long time, nobody outside a small circle of archaeologists knew this place existed, and even fewer people knew what it meant. Because what those broken vessels represent isn't a village, and it isn't a burial ground. It's a factory, a salt factory, one that was already old when Columbus was born, and one that history books about the American South almost never mention. Today we're looking at the buried industry beneath Alabama's saline springs, the indigenous peoples who built and ran it for nearly 1,000 years, and why the story of America's earliest salt mines was quietly erased from the version of Southern history most of us were taught. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what salt meant before refrigeration existed. In the modern world, salt is cheap, it's everywhere, and it's easy to forget it was ever anything else. But for centuries before European contact, salt was one of the most valuable substances a community in the interior southeast could produce. It preserved food, it seasoned a diet built heavily around corn, it was traded across enormous distances, moving from the people who made it to communities who had no local source of their own. And in the interior south, there weren't many places to get it. No easy access to ocean brine, no surface salt flats, just a handful of scattered inland springs where salty groundwater happened to reach the surface. Whoever controlled those springs controlled something everyone else needed. In southwest Alabama, in what's now Clarke County, there were several of these springs, and the archaeological record buried around them tells a story most people have never heard. Starting around 1,000 years ago, and possibly earlier, the people living in this region began coming to these saline springs, not just to collect a little salt for themselves, but to run something closer to an industrial operation. They built shallow clay basins, cheap disposable bowls made specifically for this one task, filled them with brine, and set them over slow fires for hours until the water boiled away and left behind crystallized salt. When a vessel cracked from the heat, which it did constantly, they didn't repair it. They broke it apart, took out the salt cake, and started again with a new one. Archaeologists call the debris from this process briquetage, and at some of these Alabama springs, the layers of broken briquetage run so deep that researchers have been able to date a nearly unbroken sequence of production stretching across almost a millennium. Dr. Ashley Duma, an archaeologist who has spent much of her career studying these sites, has described them as something distinct from the villages and mound centers most people picture when they think of indigenous southeastern life. These weren't places where families lived day to day. They were special purpose sites, built and returned to again and again, for one job and one job only, turning groundwater into a tradable commodity. That distinction matters because it means the people producing salt here weren't stumbling onto something incidental. They were running a specialized, organized industry with its own technology, its own labor pattern, and its own place in a much larger trade economy that connected them to communities who never saw the spring itself, but relied on what came out of it. And that's where the story starts to widen. Salt didn't stay in Clarke County. It moved. Long before European ships ever reached this coastline, salt produced at inland springs like these was already traveling through extensive indigenous trade networks that crisscrossed the greater southeast, carried alongside deerskins, pottery, and other goods between communities that spoke different languages and organized their societies in different ways. By the time European traders began pushing into the interior in the late 1600s and early 1700s, they were stepping into trade routes that had existed for generations, not creating new ones. Colonial ledgers from this period occasionally mention salt changing hands in the interior, almost as an aside, evidence that this ancient system was still functioning right up until the moment European record keeping began to overlay it. This region sat at a genuine cultural crossroads. Southwest Alabama's salines were historically closest to Choctaw territory, whose towns and hunting grounds extended across much of what is now west and central Alabama. But it also sat within reach of the powerful Muscogee, or Creek Confederacy, whose trade networks extended across the Chattahoochee, Coosa, and Tallapoosa river systems to the east. Salt, moving out of these springs, didn't respect the boundaries later drawn by European mapmakers. It moved through overlapping indigenous economic systems, and it's one of the clearest physical reminders that the southeast before contact wasn't a scattering of isolated villages. It was a connected, functioning network of specialized production and long-distance trade, and salt was one of its most important currencies. Then European colonization arrived, and for a while the story of these springs seems to quiet down in the written record. But the ground itself didn't stay quiet. If you dig down through the layers at some of these sites, you find something almost unbelievable. The prehistoric briquetage doesn't just stop and disappear under empty soil. In several places it's overlaid, directly overlaid, by 19th century industrial debris. Because during the American Civil War, the state of Alabama identified these same saline springs as a strategic resource and moved to seize and industrialize them at massive scale. In 1862, the Commissioner's Court of Clarke County appropriated funding specifically for salt manufacturing at these springs, and the state built full-scale salt works there to supply both civilians and the Confederate military, which was desperately short on the salt it needed to preserve meat for its armies. These weren't small operations. They came with worker housing, hospitals, and cemeteries. Forts were built nearby at Oven Bluff and Kearney Bluff, specifically to protect these salt works and the river routes leading to them from Union raids. So think about what that actually means standing on that ground. The exact same springs that indigenous communities had been working continuously for roughly 900 years before a single European ship reached this coastline were, by the 1860s, being fought over and fortified by a nation that didn't exist when that first clay vessel was set over a fire. Two entirely different people, separated by nearly a millennium, looked at the same trickle of salty groundwater and reached the same conclusion. This is worth protecting. This is worth building an entire operation around. The Confederate salt works weren't discovering something new. They were the latest chapter in a story that had already been running for centuries. And that's really the turning point in this story, because it exposes something uncomfortable about how regional history usually gets told. If you pick up most general histories of the antebellum South, salt production tends to appear as a Confederate wartime innovation, a clever workaround for a blockaded nation cut off from imported salt. Some accounts might briefly mention that Indians once used these springs too, almost as a footnote, a curiosity before the real history begins. But the archaeological record doesn't support that framing at all. It shows nearly 1,000 years of organized, technologically consistent, large-scale industrial production run by people who understood exactly what they had and built specialized infrastructure to exploit it, long before anyone drew a state line through Alabama. The Confederacy didn't found an industry here. It inherited one and then wrote its own chapter as if it were the first page. Why does that framing persist? Partly it's a documentation problem. European and American written records only go back so far, and for a long time archaeology in this region focused more on monumental sites, the big mound centres that photograph well and draw tourists, than on unglamorous industrial debris like broken salt pots scattered across a hillside. Briquetage doesn't look impressive. It's not a pyramid or a sprawling plaza. It's trash, quite literally, discarded fragments from a task performed over and over for generations. But trash, it turns out, is one of the most honest records archaeology can leave us, because nobody stages garbage for future audiences. The sheer volume of it at these Alabama springs is the strongest possible evidence that whatever happened here wasn't occasional or incidental. It was sustained, organized, economically serious work. Which brings us back to where we started, standing over that buried pavement of broken pottery in the Alabama Pine Flats. It isn't a mystery in the sense of an unsolved crime or a hidden treasure. The archaeology here is well documented, published, and generally accepted among specialists. The mystery, if there is one, is a quieter kind. It's the question of why a nearly 1,000-year record of indigenous industrial achievement, sitting in plain sight beneath ground that later became a literal Confederate war asset, still hasn't fully made its way into the popular story most people know about the American South. The springs kept their secret not because anyone hid it, but because for a long time almost nobody thought to ask who was there first and what they built. Southwest Alabama's saline springs are a small patch of ground in a part of the country not usually associated with ancient industry. But scattered fragments of disposable pottery, buried under Confederate brick and 19th century foundations, tell a story that reframes an entire region's history. Long before soldiers built forts to guard this salt, long before ledgers recorded its trade value, and long before anyone called this land Alabama, people were already here, running an operation refined enough to sustain trade networks across the southeast for the better part of a millennium. The ground remembers that, even when the history books forget it. So here's the question worth sitting with. How many other places across this country hold the same kind of layered, overlooked record, an ancient industry quietly buried beneath a much more recent one that gets all the credit? If you know of a site like that, one that deserves a second look, let me know in the comments and I'll see you in the next documentary.